911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was soft, barely audible amidst the crackle of the old phone line. Can you bring me a pizza, please? Elisa's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her usual efficiency momentarily disrupted. Excuse me? Did you say a pizza? Yes, ma'am. I'm really hungry. I haven't eaten in 3 days. There was a slight quiver in the boy's voice that sent a chill down Elisa's spine. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:30 p.m. The night shift was just beginning, and she had been prepared for the usual round of noise complaints, maybe a fender bender or two. But this, a child calling 911 for food, something wasn't right. Sweetheart, where are your parents? Can I speak to them? They're sleeping. They won't wake up, the boy answered, his voice barely above a whisper, each word dragging like it was too heavy for him to lift. Elisa felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. This was no prank. She'd been doing this job long enough to recognize when something was truly wrong, and this situation screamed for attention. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Neglect, abuse, something far worse. Her training kicked in, overriding the initial disbelief. Don't worry, honey. We're going to help you. Can you tell me your name? Ethan, he murmured. My name's Ethan. Okay, Ethan. I need you to stay on the line with me. I'm going to send some officers over to help you, all right? Elisa quickly punched in the address that appeared on her screen, her fingers moving with purpose now. She flagged it as a priority and shot the details over to the nearest patrol car. Sarah and Benedict were the closest officers available, and she knew they could handle whatever awaited them at that address. She had worked with them long enough to trust their judgment and capability in the field. Sarah glanced at Benedict as they sped down the narrow roads of the Alabama suburb. The heat still lingered in the air, the kind that clung to your skin like an unwelcome reminder of the sun's relentless punishment earlier in the day. The windows were down, but the rush of warm wind did little to cool their nerves. You think it's another prank? Benedict asked, his tone light but eyes focused on the road ahead. Sarah shook her head, her gut telling her otherwise. Elisa doesn't call it in unless she's sure. A kid calling 911 for food. It doesn't sit right with me. Yeah, Benedict agreed, his hands tightening on the wheel. Something feels off. The silence between them grew heavier as they approached the address. The houses here were small, worn down by time and neglect. The kind of place where life felt like it was slowly unraveling at the edges. Sarah took in the sight of the house as they pulled up. A weather-beaten structure with chipped paint and a yard that had long forgotten the touch of a lawnmower. A few old toys were scattered across the dying grass, their bright colors dulled by the layers of dirt and time. Let's do this, Sarah said, stepping out of the car, her voice steady but her senses on high alert. Sarah's boots hit the gravel with a crunch as she stepped out of the car, her senses sharp and attuned to the stillness of the night. The house stood before her, a dark silhouette against the fading evening light, its appearance as worn and neglected as the patchy lawn surrounding it. The front door, hanging slightly ajar, seemed almost like an invitation, though not a welcoming one. This place gives me the creeps, Benedict muttered, his voice low. Sarah nodded but said nothing, her focus entirely on what might await them inside. Pushing the door open, Sarah was immediately struck by the stench, stale air mixed with the acrid scent of alcohol and something more sinister, something chemical and burnt that lingered unpleasantly in her nose. The interior was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls, the scant light from the street lamp outside barely penetrating the gloom. "Stay close," Sarah whispered, her voice a mere breath as they moved deeper into the house. The living room was the first area they came upon, and the sight that greeted them was enough to make even the hardened officers pause. The couch, a once plush piece of furniture now sagging and stained, bore the weight of two unmoving figures. Bottles littered the floor. Beer cans, half-empty liquor bottles, and syringes scattered carelessly, glinting ominously in the faint light. On the coffee table, just inches from the man's limp hand, lay a makeshift pipe. The telltale burn marks a clear sign of recent drug use. "Jesus!" Benedict breathed, his voice heavy with disbelief. He took a cautious step forward, leaning over to check the pulse of the man sprawled across the sofa. Sarah's eyes were drawn to the woman beside him. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow, lips tinged with an unnatural blue. As Sarah reached out to gently shake her shoulder, the woman's body jerked violently, and foam began to spill from the corners of her mouth. Simultaneously, the man's limbs stiffened in a grotesque spasm, his body convulsing uncontrollably. "Benedict!" Sarah shouted, dropping to her knees beside the woman. "They're overdosing! Call it in now!" Benedict was already on the radio, his voice calm but urgent as he relayed their situation to dispatch. "We need EMS at our location immediately. 2 adults, both unresponsive, showing signs of overdose. Possible cardiac arrest. Requesting Narcan, stat." Sarah worked quickly, her hands moving with the precision born of years on the force. She tilted the woman's head back, ensuring her airway was open, while Benedict did the same for the man. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity as they waited for the sound of sirens in the distance. The woman's convulsions began to subside, her body going limp once more, while the man's breathing became shallow but steady. Relief was a distant feeling, one that neither officer allowed themselves to fully embrace yet. Sarah kept her hand on the woman's wrist, feeling the weak, fluttering pulse, while her mind raced with thoughts of the child, Ethan. The arrival of the paramedics was swift, the flashing red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the walls as they worked to stabilize the couple. Sarah and Benedict stepped back, letting the professionals take over, but the weight in Sarah's chest only grew heavier. As the paramedics secured the couple onto stretchers, Benedict turned to Sarah, his face etched with concern. "We need to find the boy." Sarah nodded, her thoughts already racing ahead. "He's here somewhere. I'll check the bedrooms." With Benedict following close behind, Sarah made her way down the narrow hallway. The house seemed even darker now, the earlier signs of neglect turning into something more sinister with each passing moment. The first room she entered was a bedroom, small, cluttered, and filled with the unmistakable scent of desperation. Clothes were strewn across the floor, and a small child's bed sat unmade in the corner. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the room. "Ethan?" she called out softly, her voice betraying a softness she hadn't intended. A faint rustling came from the far corner of the room, near a pile of discarded toys. Sarah moved closer, her flashlight casting long, wavering shadows as it swept across the floor. There, huddled in the shadows, was a small figure, almost hidden beneath a tangle of blankets. 2 wide, terrified eyes stared back at her, the child clutching a cordless phone to his chest like a lifeline. "Ethan, it's okay," Sarah whispered, lowering herself to his level. "I'm Officer Sarah, and I'm here to help you. You're safe now." The boy didn't move, his small frame shaking with a fear so palpable it almost broke Sarah's heart. His eyes darted around the room, as if expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. Sarah reached out a hand, moving slowly, showing him that she meant no harm. "It's all right, Ethan. You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're okay," she coaxed gently, her voice steady and warm. For a moment, Ethan didn't respond, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Sarah could see the bruises on his arms, the way he flinched when the shadows shifted on the wall. Whatever had happened here had left more than just physical scars. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan slowly released his grip on the phone and let it fall to the floor. With a hesitant glance, he crawled out from under the blankets, inching toward Sarah, his movements slow and wary. Sarah held her breath as the boy reached out, his small hand trembling as it touched hers. She wrapped her fingers around his, feeling the coldness of his skin, and pulled him gently into her arms. "You're safe now," she whispered, holding him close as his little body shook with silent sobs. "I've got you." As Sarah cradled the boy, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of hell this child had endured, what nightmares he had lived through. Sarah held Ethan close, feeling the slight tremors that still racked his small frame. The boy's face was buried against her shoulder, his breath coming in quick, uneven gasps, as if he were trying to keep himself from crying out loud. Sarah could feel the dampness of his tears soaking through her uniform, but she didn't mind. All she cared about was keeping him calm, keeping him safe. "It's okay, Ethan. You're safe now," she murmured softly, her hand gently rubbing his back in slow, soothing circles. The rhythmic motion seemed to have a calming effect, and gradually Ethan's breathing began to even out. But the tension in his body didn't completely dissipate. Sarah could still feel it. The fear, the wariness, the deep-seated anxiety that only came from experiencing things no child should ever have to endure. After a few more moments, Ethan lifted his head, his wide, tear-filled eyes meeting Sarah's with a mixture of hesitation and trust. Are they gone?" he whispered, his voice so faint that Sarah had to lean in to hear him. Sarah hesitated, not wanting to give him false hope, but also knowing she needed to be honest. "Your mum and dad are getting help," she said carefully. "But right now, it's just you and me, okay? We're going to get you out of here." Ethan nodded slowly, his small hands gripping tightly onto Sarah's shirt as if she were his lifeline. Sarah's heart ached at the sight of him, so fragile, yet so resilient. She knew she needed to move quickly, but carefully, not wanting to scare him any more than he already was. "Ethan, can I take a look at you?" she asked gently, her tone soft but firm. "I just want to make sure you're okay." Ethan hesitated for a moment before nodding again, his eyes still locked onto hers. Sarah slowly eased him away from her chest, just enough to get a better look at him. What she saw made her heart sink even further. Ethan's arms and legs were covered in bruises, some fresh, some faded to that sickly yellow that marked old wounds. There were small cuts on his knees, likely from falling or being pushed down, and as her gaze traveled higher, she noticed the faint outline of handprints on his arms. But what caught her breath was the thin scar running across his cheek, a cruel mark that stood out starkly against his pale skin. "Who did this to you, Ethan?" Sarah asked, even though she already knew the answer. Ethan glanced down, his small fingers tracing the edge of his shirt. "Mom," he whispered, barely audible. "But it's okay. She didn't mean it. She was just having a bad day." Sarah's chest tightened, anger bubbling up inside her, not at Ethan, but at the world that had allowed this to happen. But she kept her voice calm, not wanting to upset him any further. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. You didn't deserve that." Ethan shrugged slightly, as if it didn't matter. "I just want her to be happy," he said quietly. "When she smiles, it's like everything's okay. Even when it hurts, it's okay if she's happy." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, focusing on Ethan. "You're so brave, Ethan, but you shouldn't have to go through this. We're going to get you somewhere safe, where people will take care of you and make sure you're okay. I promise." She carefully lifted Ethan into her arms, feeling how light he was, how easily she could carry him. He didn't protest, just wrapped his arms around her neck and held on tightly, as if afraid to let go. Sarah walked through the darkened house, her steps purposeful but gentle, not wanting to jar the boy in her arms. The weight of his small body was a reminder of the fragility of life, of how easily it could be damaged, yet also how resilient it could be. Outside, the night air was cool against Sarah's skin, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside the house. The paramedics were still tending to Ethan's parents, but Sarah didn't stop to check on them. Her priority was Ethan now, getting him the care he so desperately needed. At the hospital, Ethan was examined thoroughly, his injuries documented, his health assessed. Sarah stayed by his side the entire time, holding his hand, offering words of comfort. She knew the road ahead for Ethan would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and uncertainties. But she also knew that he was a survivor, and with the right support, he could heal, both physically and emotionally. When the doctors were done, and Ethan was settled into a room at the hospital, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. She sat beside his bed, watching as his eyes fluttered closed, exhaustion finally claiming him. She knew he would be safe here, at least for tonight. Tomorrow, the social workers would come, and decisions would be made about Ethan's future. But for now, Sarah stayed with him, unwilling to leave him alone in the dark. The morning light crept through the blinds of Ethan's hospital room, casting soft, pale beams across the sterile white sheets. Sarah had stayed through the night, her presence a silent vigil over the sleeping boy. She hadn't closed her eyes, too many thoughts swirling in her mind, questions about what would happen next, about how Ethan would cope with everything once the reality set in. The door to the room opened quietly, and a nurse stepped in, checking the monitors and adjusting Ethan's IV. Sarah watched, her heart heavy as she thought about the day ahead. Today, the truth would begin to unravel, and with it, the fragile world Ethan had known, however broken, would be shattered. By midday, Ethan's parents had been stabilized and transported to the county jail. Their overdose had not been fatal, but the consequences of their actions were just beginning. As Sarah left the hospital, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread about what she would soon learn. She had seen this before, the cycle of addiction, the neglect, the way children like Ethan were often the silent victims of a life they had no control over. At the police station, Sarah met with Detective Sanders, a seasoned investigator who had taken on Ethan's case. His face was lined with the weariness of someone who had seen too much of the world's darker side, but there was a sharpness in his eyes, a determination to get to the bottom of this. "They're being questioned now," Sanders said, his voice a low rumble. "It's not looking good." Sarah nodded, her stomach twisting with a mix of anger and sorrow. "What have they said so far?" Sanders leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. The mother was the first to break. She admitted to everything, the drug use, the abuse. But what's worse, she said they only kept Ethan around for the welfare checks. To them, he was nothing more than a meal ticket. Sarah felt a cold wave wash over her, the words cutting deeper than she had expected. She had seen neglect before, but to hear that Ethan's parents had viewed him as nothing more than a burden, an inconvenience they endured for money, it was a level of cruelty that was hard to fathom. And the father? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "Same story," Sanders replied. He confirmed it, said they didn't care what happened to the boy as long as the checks kept coming in. When the money ran out, so did their patients. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the image of Ethan, small, frightened, desperately clinging to her the night before. How could people be so callous, so devoid of the most basic human decency? "He doesn't need to know," Sarah said finally, her voice firm. "Ethan, he doesn't need to know that his parents never loved him. Let him believe they were sick, that they couldn't help what they did. He's been through enough." Sanders nodded in agreement, his expression softening slightly. "We'll keep that from the reports. The boy's got enough scars to carry." The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, court dates, and meetings with social services. Ethan's parents were officially charged with child endangerment, drug possession, and neglect. Their sentences were swift and harsh, years in prison with no possibility of parole. Ethan had always been small for his age, but as the days stretched into weeks at the hospital, he seemed to shrink even further, retreating into himself as though he could make the world disappear by simply withdrawing from it. The doctors and nurses marveled at his resilience, calling him a little superhero for surviving 3 days without food in a house filled with despair and danger. But Ethan didn't feel like a superhero. He felt like a little boy who had lost everything: his home, his parents, even the semblance of security he had once clung to, no matter how fragile it had been. The social workers moved quickly, knowing that the longer Ethan stayed in the hospital, the harder it would be for him to adjust to a new life. They placed him with the Hendersons, a foster family known for their kindness and stability. Sarah had vetted them herself, ensuring that Ethan would be in a home where he could start to heal, where he could learn what it meant to be truly cared for. The Hendersons' house was a world away from the dark, cluttered rooms Ethan had known. It was a modest home, tucked away on a quiet street lined with trees that rustled gently in the breeze. The front yard was neat, with flowers blooming along the walkway and a sturdy oak tree that stood tall and strong, much like the family who lived there. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson were in their late 50s, with grown children who had long since moved out, leaving behind a house that was now filled with the echoes of laughter from the past. They welcomed Ethan with open arms, their voices warm and soothing as they introduced him to his new surroundings. "This is your room, Ethan," Mrs. Henderson said softly, opening the door to a bright, sunlit space with a small bed covered in a colorful quilt. There were toys neatly arranged on shelves, books stacked on a little wooden desk, and a window that looked out onto the backyard, where a swing hung from a sturdy branch. Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes wide, unsure of what to make of this new world. It was all so different, clean, organized, quiet. He didn't know what to do with himself, didn't know how to behave in a place that didn't seem to carry the weight of sadness and fear. Mrs. Henderson knelt down beside him, her smile gentle. "You don't have to be afraid, Ethan. This is your home now. You can play with the toys, read the books, or just rest if you're tired. We're here for you." Ethan nodded slowly, but he didn't move from his spot in the doorway. The Hendersons didn't push him. They let him take his time, understanding that he needed to adjust at his own pace. The first few days were difficult. Ethan was quiet, withdrawn, often sitting by the window in his room, staring out at the backyard without really seeing it. He barely touched the food Mrs. Henderson lovingly prepared, and he flinched whenever Mr. Henderson's deep voice echoed down the hallway, though the man was always careful to speak softly when Ethan was near. But slowly, day by day, something began to change. It started with small things: a shy glance at Mrs. Henderson as she read a story aloud, a tentative reach for a toy truck that had caught his eye. The Hendersons noticed, but they didn't draw attention to it, letting Ethan find his way at his own pace. One afternoon, as Mrs. Henderson was tending to the garden, she looked up to see Ethan standing on the porch, watching her. She smiled and waved, and after a long moment, Ethan lifted his hand in a small wave back. It was a tiny gesture, but to Mrs. Henderson, it felt like a breakthrough. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to open up. He started playing with the toys in his room, exploring the backyard, and even swinging from the oak tree's sturdy branch. He still had his moments of fear, of hesitation, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. The nightmares that had plagued him nightly began to lessen, replaced by dreams of running through fields, of laughter and light. Sarah visited regularly, always bringing a small gift: a new book, a puzzle, a stuffed animal. Each time, Ethan's face would light up, and he would run to her, hugging her tightly, as if she were his anchor to this new world he was navigating. And each time, Sarah felt her heart swell with relief and joy, knowing that Ethan was healing, that he was finding his way out of the darkness. On one of her visits, Sarah sat with Ethan on the porch swing, watching the sun set behind the trees. Ethan rested his head on her shoulder, a contented sigh escaping his lips. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah smiled, her arm around his small shoulders. "For what, Ethan?" "For everything," he replied, his eyes closing as the last rays of sunlight bathed them in a warm glow. "For saving me." Sarah's heart ached with love for the boy she had rescued. "You saved yourself, Ethan. You're stronger than you know." Ethan smiled softly, the words settling into his heart where they would stay, a reminder of his journey from the shadows into the light. As they sat together, Sarah knew that while the road ahead might still be long and filled with challenges, Ethan was no longer walking it alone. He had found a place where he was loved, where he could finally begin to grow, not just in body, but in spirit as well. Ethan was finally home. Ethan's story didn't just end with his rescue. In fact, for many in the community, it marked the beginning of something much larger. The tale of a small boy surviving in unimaginable circumstances spread like wildfire through the town and beyond, touching hearts and igniting a fervor for change that had long been dormant. The story was featured in local newspapers, discussed in church sermons, and became the centerpiece of town meetings. Ethan had unknowingly become a symbol, a call to action for those who had seen too much and done too little. As people learned about Ethan's ordeal, they were moved not only by his resilience, but by the stark reality of how easily children like him could fall through the cracks. It was a reminder that the system designed to protect the most vulnerable often failed to do so, and it stirred a deep sense of responsibility among the community members. The first to act were the local charity organizations. They had always been there, in the background, providing aid to families in need, but now they felt the need to step up their efforts. A coalition of these organizations came together to create a series of initiatives focused on child welfare. They organized fundraisers, awareness campaigns, and even set up a hotline where people could report suspected cases of child abuse and neglect anonymously. The movement gained momentum quickly, with volunteers pouring in from all corners of the community. Retirees, students, local business owners, all eager to contribute their time and resources to ensure that no child would ever endure what Ethan had. The once quiet town was suddenly alive with activity, as neighbors came together to support one another and to build a stronger, more vigilant community. One of the most significant outcomes of this movement was the formation of the Ethan's Guardians program, named in honor of the boy whose story had inspired it all. The program paired trained volunteers with at-risk children, offering mentorship, tutoring, and a safe space where kids could simply be kids. The goal was to create a network of trusted adults who could intervene before a situation spiraled out of control, providing support not just to the children, but to their families as well. Sarah, who had been there from the beginning, became an integral part of this initiative. Her first-hand experience with Ethan had left an indelible mark on her, and she was determined to make a difference. She volunteered as a mentor, working closely with children who had been identified as vulnerable by teachers, social workers, and community members. Each week, she would meet with her assigned child, offering not just guidance, but a listening ear, a reassuring presence in a world that often seemed too big and too scary. The movement didn't stop at grassroots efforts. The local government took notice of the growing activism and began to implement changes of its own. They allocated funds to improve child protective services, hired more social workers, and established a task force dedicated to preventing child abuse and neglect. The task force worked closely with schools, hospitals, and law enforcement to ensure that no warning signs were missed. No cry for help went unanswered. The town's response was overwhelming. Ethan's story had awakened something in the people, a recognition that every child deserved to be nurtured, to be safe, to have a chance at a future free from fear. It was as if Ethan's bravery had infused the entire community with a renewed sense of purpose. Ethan, unaware of the full extent of the impact he had made, continued to thrive in his new home with the Hendersons. He was safe, loved, and finally free to enjoy the simple joys of childhood. But even as he played in the backyard or swung from the oak tree's branch, the legacy of his story continued to grow. The December air was crisp, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones but was offset by the warmth of holiday lights that twinkled along the quiet streets. Sarah's car moved slowly down the snow-dusted road, her headlights cutting through the early evening fog. She hadn't been back to the Hendersons in a few weeks, but tonight was special. It was Christmas Eve, and she carried a small pizza box on the passenger seat next to her, alongside a neatly wrapped present, a gift for Ethan. As she pulled up to the Hendersons' house, Sarah felt a swell of emotion. The house looked as welcoming as ever, adorned with lights that cast a soft glow across the front yard. The oak tree in the backyard was just visible, its branches bare now, but still standing tall, like a silent guardian watching over the house. She stepped out of the car, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The weight of the past year hung over her like a shadow, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Ethan was safe now, that he was thriving. With the pizza in one hand and the present in the other, she made her way to the front door. Before she could knock, the door swung open, and there stood Ethan, his eyes wide with surprise and joy. He had grown since the last time she saw him. There was a new steadiness in his gaze, a confidence that hadn't been there before. He still had the same tousled hair and bright eyes, but there was something different about him now, something stronger. "Sarah!" Ethan exclaimed, his voice full of excitement. He didn't hesitate before throwing his arms around her, the warmth of his hug a stark contrast to the cold outside. "Hey, champ," Sarah said, returning the hug with one arm as she balanced the pizza and present in the other. "Merry Christmas." Ethan stepped back, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the pizza box. "Is that for me?" "Sure is," Sarah said with a smile. "Thought you might like a little holiday treat." Come in," Ethan said eagerly, grabbing her hand and pulling her into the house. The warmth hit her immediately, the smell of pine and cinnamon filling the air. A Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, decorated with ornaments that looked handmade, probably by Ethan and the Hendersons. The room was filled with a cozy glow, the kind that made you feel at home, even if you were just visiting. Mrs. Henderson appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her face lit up when she saw Sarah. "Sarah, what a wonderful surprise. We were just about to sit down for dinner." "I hope I'm not interrupting," Sarah said, though she knew from the warmth in Mrs. Henderson's voice that she was always welcome here. "Not at all," Mrs. Henderson replied, her eyes softening as she looked at Ethan. "We're just so happy you could join us. Ethan's been talking about you non-stop." Ethan grinned, a bit of his old shyness returning. "I wanted you to see the tree. I helped decorate it." "It's beautiful, Ethan," Sarah said, genuinely impressed by the craftsmanship of the ornaments and the careful placement of each one. "You did an amazing job." Mr. Henderson joined them, greeting Sarah with a firm handshake and a welcoming smile. The sense of family here was palpable, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for these people who had taken Ethan in, given him the love and stability he so desperately needed. They sat down to dinner, the small table crowded with festive dishes. Sarah watched as Ethan chatted animatedly about his new school, his friends, and the Christmas play he had been in. It was a stark contrast to the quiet, fearful boy she had met months ago. Ethan had found his voice, his place in the world, and it was clear that he was flourishing. After dinner, they gathered around the tree. Sarah handed Ethan the present she had brought, watching as he carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a small model airplane, something he could build with his own hands. Ethan's eyes sparkled as he held it up, turning it over in his hands with awe. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I love it." "You're welcome, Ethan," Sarah replied, feeling her heart swell with pride. "I knew you'd do something amazing with it." As the evening wound down, they gathered on the couch, Ethan nestled between Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, his head resting on Mrs. Henderson's shoulder. Sarah sat nearby, watching the fire crackle in the hearth, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you for everything you've done for Ethan," Mrs. Henderson said quietly, her eyes meeting Sarah's. "We can't imagine our lives without him now. He's brought so much joy to our home." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "He's a special kid. I'm just glad he found his way to you." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the Christmas tree. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the world in a quiet stillness that felt like a promise of new beginnings. As Sarah prepared to leave, Ethan hugged her tightly once more. "Will you come back for my birthday?" he asked, his voice hopeful. "Of course, Ethan," Sarah replied, smiling down at him. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." As she drove away from the Hendersons' house, the image of Ethan waving from the doorway stayed with her, a reminder of how far he had come. The darkness that had once overshadowed his life was fading, replaced by the light of a new beginning, a new family, and a future filled with hope. Sarah knew that Ethan's story was far from over, but tonight, as she made her way home through the softly falling snow, she allowed herself to believe in happy endings. For Ethan, for the Hendersons, and for herself. This was a night of warmth, of love, and of the quiet strength that had carried them all through the hardest of times. Wow, what a journey we've just witnessed. Ethan's story is truly one of resilience, hope, and the power of love. From the depths of despair, this little boy found his way to a brighter future, thanks to the kindness of strangers who became his family. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments, There is always a chance for redemption, for healing, and for new beginnings. Ethan's transformation is a testament to the strength we all have within us, and it shows just how much difference compassion and community can make. Let's remember that there are many Ethans out there who need our help and support. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Ethan's journey resonated with you the most? Drop a comment below and let's keep this important conversation going. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. Mia woke to an eerie silence. Her mother, usually awake and cheerful, lay cold and unresponsive. No amount of shaking could rouse her. Terrified, Mia called 911. "My mommy won't wake up," she whispered into the phone, her voice cracking with fear. When the police finally broke down the door, they were shocked to their core by what they found inside. What had happened to Mia's mother? And would she ever wake up? Mia's small fingers fumbled with the edges of her blanket as she lay in bed, the soft fabric offering little comfort against the gnawing feeling in her chest. Something was off this morning, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The apartment was unusually quiet. No smell of coffee, no clatter of pots and pans, no sound of her mother humming to herself in the kitchen. Usually, by now, Mia would be up and about, drawn to the kitchen by the sound of music, where her mother, Sarah, would greet her with a warm smile and a hug. Mornings were their favorite time of day, a special routine they shared just between the two of them. It had always been just the two of them. Mia's father had never been in the picture. He had left as soon as Sarah told him about the pregnancy, vanishing from their lives without a trace. But he wasn't missed. Sarah had made sure of that. She had poured all her love and attention into raising Mia, ensuring that her daughter never felt the absence of a father. Their mornings were filled with laughter as they danced around the small, cramped kitchen, the strains of old tunes filling the air. After breakfast, Mia would head to daycare and Sarah would go to work. But today was different, and Mia could sense it from the moment she woke up. She slipped out of bed and tiptoed into her mother's room, the floorboards creaking softly under her small feet. The door to her mother's bedroom was slightly ajar, but there was no movement from within. Mia pushed it open a little wider, peeking inside. "Mommy?" she called softly, but there was no response. Sarah lay on the bed, her body still, her breathing shallow. The alarm clock was buzzing faintly beside her, its shrill sound filling the room, but Sarah hadn't turned it off like she usually did. Mia's brow furrowed with worry. She climbed onto the bed beside her mother, reaching over to turn off the alarm. She sat there for a moment, staring at Sarah, who hadn't so much as flinched at the noise. She must be very tired, Mia thought to herself. After all, her mother worked hard, often late into the night to make ends meet. Mia was too young to understand that something could be terribly wrong. After a few more moments of waiting, Mia decided to get dressed by herself. She picked out her clothes, slipping into her little shoes, and then padded into the living room. She expected her mother to follow her any moment, as she always did. But minutes ticked by, and still, Sarah didn't appear. Mia turned on the TV, trying to focus on her usual morning show. But her tummy eventually began to growl. Normally by this time her mother would be up, dancing around the kitchen as she prepared breakfast. But today there was only silence. A knot of worry tightened in Mia's chest. She decided to check on her mother one more time. The small girl walked back to the bedroom, her heart beating faster with each step. "Mom, are you awake?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm hungry." But, again, there was no response. Mia approached the bed cautiously, climbing up beside her mother. She reached out to touch Sarah's arm, shaking her gently. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. But Sarah didn't stir. Mia's heart began to race, her small chest tightening with panic. She shook her mother again, harder this time, but still, there was nothing. Tears welled up in Mia's eyes, and she felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She didn't know what to do. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, Mia remembered what her mother had told her about emergencies. There was a number she could call if something bad happened, if she ever needed help. Mia ran downstairs, her tiny feet barely making a sound on the cold floor. She grabbed the phone, her small fingers trembling as she tried to remember the number. 911, she whispered to herself, and with a shaky breath, she dialed the number. Holding the phone close to her ear, she ran back to her mother's side. "Don't worry, Mommy," she said softly, trying to reassure herself as much as her mother. "I will get you some help." The phone crackled to life and a deep, gentle voice spoke on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? Mia's voice trembled as she replied, "My mommy. She's been sleeping all day, and she won't wake up." There was a brief pause, and then the man's voice returned, even softer this time. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry to hear that, but you did a very good job calling me. Can you tell me your name?" "Mia," she said, her voice a little stronger now that she was speaking to someone. "Can you come and help me?" "Of course, Mia. I'm sending someone to help right away, but I need you to stay with me on the phone for a little bit, okay? Can you do that?" "Yes," Mia whispered, clutching the phone tightly. "You're doing really well, Mia. Is it just you and your mommy at home?" "Yes," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. "It's just me and mommy. She never woke up this morning." "Okay, darling. Where is your mommy now?" "She's in her bed, in her room," Mia answered, glancing back toward the hallway. "Good job, Mia. Do you know where you live? Can you tell me your address so we can find you?" Mia recited her address as best as she could remember, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The man on the other end of the line was warm and reassuring, his words soothing the sharp edges of her panic. "You're being so brave, Mia. The ambulance is on its way now, and they'll be there very soon. You're not alone, okay? I'm right here with you." Mia stayed on the line, answering all the questions he asked. All the while, she kept her eyes on her mother, willing her to wake up, to give her that comforting smile she always did in the mornings. The minutes dragged on, and Mia began to worry that help might never arrive. She stayed close to her mother, whispering soft reassurances, not knowing if her words could even reach her. Finally, the sound of sirens filled the air, faint at first, then growing louder. Relief washed over Mia as the flashing lights of the ambulance pulled up outside. "They're here, sweetheart," the gentle voice on the phone reassured her. "They're going to take care of everything now." Mia dashed into the living room, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and fear. She could hear the heavy footsteps of the paramedics rushing up the stairs, their boots thudding against the metal steps with urgency. They were here. They were really here. But her mother was still lying in bed, unmoving, and that thought filled her with a fresh wave of panic. The loud knock on the door jolted Mia back to the moment. "I'm here!" she called out, her voice trembling as she reached for the door handle. She stretched as high as she could, her tiny fingers just barely brushing against the cool metal. "Mia, we need you to open the door handle," one of the men called from the other side. The voice was firm but kind, full of a warmth that calmed Mia's nerves just a little. But no matter how hard she tried, Mia couldn't get a good grip on the handle. Her fingers slipped, and she stumbled back, feeling the frustration bubble up inside her. "I can't reach it," she whispered, tears threatening to spill over. She wasn't about to give up, though. She knew she had to open the door. They needed to help her mother. Mia's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could give her the boost she needed. Her gaze landed on a small black box sitting on the dining table. Without hesitation, she scrambled over, dragging the box to the door. She climbed on top, her little hands trembling as she reached up again. But even with the box, she was still too small. There has to be something else, Mia thought desperately. She scanned the room again, and that's when she saw it. A chair, sturdy and wooden, tucked under the table. Of course. Why hadn't she thought of that before? With newfound determination, Mia ran over to the chair and tried to lift it. But it was heavier than she expected. She tugged and pulled, inching it towards the door, but the rug caught under one of the legs, causing the chair to tilt. Mia gasped as she lost her balance, falling forward. She hit the floor hard, face first, and before she could react, the chair toppled over, landing squarely on top of her. Pain shot through Mia's body, but worse than the pain was the feeling of helplessness. The weight of the chair pinned her down, trapping her on the cold floor. She struggled to push it off, using her back to try and lift it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. "Mommy, I'm stuck," she whimpered, her voice trembling with fear. "Mia, are you okay?" The man's voice came through the door, his concern evident even through the thick wood. "I'm stuck," Mia cried, her voice breaking as she fought back tears. She could hear the rumbling noises from the other side, the sounds of the men trying to get in. But all she wanted was to help her mother, and now she couldn't even move. "Don't worry, Mia. We'll be with you in a minute," the man reassured her. But Mia could hear the uncertainty in his voice. How were they going to get in if the door was locked and she couldn't open it? Mia's mind raced as she lay there, pinned under the chair. What if they couldn't get in? What if they left? "Please don't leave me," she sobbed, the fear in her voice clear as day. "We wouldn't leave you, darling," came the gentle response. "We're just grabbing a few supplies from downstairs. Hold on tight. And don't be scared. You will hear a loud bang in a couple of seconds. Listen carefully and try to stay as calm as possible, all right, Mia?" Mia nodded, even though they couldn't see her. "Okay," she whispered, trying to calm herself. She squeezed her eyes shut and covered her ears with her hands, bracing herself for the noise. "Cover your ears, Mia," another voice instructed, this one a little firmer, but just as kind. Mia closed her eyes tighter, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited. And then it came, a loud blow that echoed through the living room, making the floor beneath her vibrate. She flinched, but the chair held her down, preventing her from moving. Another blow came, and this time she opened one eye just a crack. She could see the door shaking, and with the third blow, she noticed it shift slightly. They were trying to break it down. Splinters began to fly off with the fourth blow, and Mia quickly closed her eyes again, waiting for it to be over. But then, suddenly the noise stopped. Mia opened her eyes, panic rising in her chest as she realized the door was still in place. Why had they stopped? Her mind whirled with questions, fear creeping back in. She could hear the men talking outside, their voices low and serious. It didn't sound good. Mia knew she couldn't just lie there anymore. She had to do something, anything, to help her mother. Summoning all the strength she had left, Mia began to wiggle her arm out from under the chair. She remembered how the legs had caught on the rug, and an idea formed in her mind. With determination, Mia reached out and slipped her fingers between the chair leg and the carpet. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for what she knew would be a difficult task. She counted down in her head, then gave the chair leg a hard push. To her surprise, the chair shifted slightly. Encouraged, she pushed again, this time with all her might. Slowly, the chair began to move, and Mia felt the weight lifting off her tiny body. With one final push, the chair toppled over, and she was free. Mia let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, a small cheer escaping her lips as she scrambled to her feet. She didn't waste a second. Mia bolted back to her mother's room, her heart pounding with both fear and pride. "Mommy, I did it! I'm coming to help!" she called out as she ran. But when she reached the bedside, her mother was still lying there, eyes closed, unmoving. But something was wrong, very wrong. Sarah's body, once so still, now began to jerk violently. Her arms and legs thrashed against the bed, her mouth opening and closing uncontrollably. Mia's eyes widened in terror as she realized her mother was having a seizure. She had never seen anything like this before, and the sight of it filled her with a dread so deep it threatened to paralyze her. Sarah's mouth suddenly clamped shut, and a small trickle of blood began to seep from her lips. Mia gasped in horror, realizing that her mother had bitten down on her own tongue during the seizure. Without thinking, Mia acted on pure instinct. She was terrified that her mother was in pain, that the biting might hurt her more. So, with trembling hands, Mia reached out and gently pried her mother's mouth open, just enough to slip her own tiny fingers inside. "Mommy, it's okay," Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm here, Mommy. I'm right here." The moment Mia's fingers touched her mother's teeth, a sharp pain shot through her hand as Sarah's jaws clenched down hard. Mia whimpered, tears streaming down her face as the pain intensified. But she refused to pull her hand away. She couldn't let her mother hurt herself. Not like this. "It's okay, Mommy," she repeated through her sobs, trying to keep her voice steady, even as the agony in her fingers grew unbearable. She didn't know how long she held on, but it felt like forever. Every second stretched into an eternity as Mia battled against the pain, against the fear that gripped her heart. Finally, as suddenly as it had begun, the seizure ended. Sarah's body went limp, her mouth relaxing just enough for Mia to pull her hand free. Mia cradled her injured hand to her chest, fresh tears spilling over as she looked at her mother's still form. Blood from the bite wound dripped from her fingers, but Mia barely noticed. All she could see was her mother, lying there, so quiet, so pale. "Mommy," Mia whispered, her voice small and broken. "Please be okay." At that moment, a loud bang came from the living room. The door finally gave way, and the paramedics rushed in. Mia stumbled back from the bed, her entire body shaking as she watched the scene unfold. The paramedics were everywhere, their voices urgent as they moved quickly to help her mother. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes, knelt down beside Mia. "You're so brave, sweetheart," she said softly, taking Mia's injured hand in her own. "We're going to take care of your mommy now." Mia nodded, though her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. "Will she be okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We're going to do everything we can," the paramedic assured her. She carefully wrapped Mia's hand in a soft cloth, trying to stem the flow of blood. "You did everything right, Mia. You helped your mummy so much." The apartment was a flurry of motion and noise as paramedics and police officers moved with urgent precision. Mia stood at the edge of the chaos, her heart pounding in her chest, her injured hand clutched tightly against her side. The paramedic who had spoken to her earlier wrapped her small hand in a cloth, the gentle pressure of it doing little to ease the throbbing pain that pulsed through her fingers. But Mia didn't care about the pain. Her eyes were fixed on her mother, lying so still on the stretcher, surrounded by people who were talking in hurried, hushed tones. Mia ran into the arms of one of the officers, clinging to him as if he could somehow make all of this go away. He knelt down, his expression softening as he looked into her frightened eyes. "It's okay, Mia," he said gently. "We're going to take care of your mummy." She nodded, but the fear gnawing at her insides wouldn't let go. She led the officer to her mother, who was now being lifted carefully onto the stretcher. Mia hovered close, her breath catching every time her mother's body twitched or jerked involuntarily. The seizure had left Sarah weakened, and every little movement seemed to drain more color from her face. Why are they in such a hurry? Mia wondered as she watched the paramedics exchange worried glances. They were moving quickly, more quickly than she had ever seen adults move, as if there was something about her mother that frightened even them. One of the paramedics gave a quick nod to the others, and they began to wheel the stretcher out of the apartment. Mia followed closely, her small legs struggling to keep up with their long strides. When they reached the ambulance, the back doors were flung open, and the stretcher was lifted inside with a practiced efficiency that left Mia feeling dizzy. She scrambled in after them, refusing to let go of her mother's hand. "I'm coming too," she said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. The paramedic, who had spoken to her earlier, gave her a reassuring smile and helped her into a seat beside her mother. "Of course you are," she said, her voice calm and kind. "We wouldn't leave you behind." The doors of the ambulance slammed shut, and within seconds they were speeding through the streets, the siren wailing loudly above them. Mia's heart raced with the rhythm of the siren, the noise filling her head with a sense of urgency she didn't fully understand. Her mother lay on the stretcher, her breathing shallow and labored. Mia watched as the paramedics worked frantically, their faces tense with concentration. Sarah's chest began to heave, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. Mia felt a surge of panic as she saw her mother's body convulse once more, the violent jerking sending shockwaves through the small space. "Mommy!" Mia cried out, tears streaming down her face. She had never seen her mother so weak, so vulnerable. It terrified her in a way she couldn't put into words. She reached out, her tiny hand finding her mother's, gripping it tightly as if she could anchor her mother to the world of the living. The paramedic closest to Sarah noticed the change immediately. "She's seizing again," he called out, his voice laced with urgency. The team moved quickly, adjusting the oxygen mask on Sarah's face, administering medication, doing everything they could to stabilize her. Mia felt completely helpless. She had always thought of her mother as the strongest person in the world, but now, seeing her like this, Mia wasn't sure of anything anymore. All she could do was sit there, holding her mother's hand, her small body racked with sobs. The paramedics worked tirelessly, their movements a blur of focused energy. Mia heard snippets of their conversations, words like critical and time-sensitive that made her heart clench even tighter with fear. She closed her eyes, praying silently for her mother to wake up, for the ambulance to get to the hospital in time. Finally, the ambulance came to a jarring stop outside the hospital, the doors flying open as the paramedics rushed Sarah inside. Mia followed, her legs barely able to carry her as she stumbled after them. She was dimly aware of the hospital's bright lights, the sterile smell, the hurried footsteps and beeping machines. But all she could focus on was her mother, lying so still on the hospital bed as they wheeled her away. Mia was gently pulled aside by a nurse who knelt down to her level, speaking softly. "Sweetheart, we're going to take good care of your mommy now," she said, her voice warm and comforting. "She's in the best hands." Mia nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the doors where they had taken her mother. All she could do now was wait and hope. The hospital was a maze of bright lights and unfamiliar sounds, the sterile smell of antiseptic hanging heavy in the air. Mia clung to the nurse's hand as they led her through the wide, echoing hallways. Her small legs struggled to keep up, but she refused to let go, not wanting to be left behind. Not when her mother was somewhere in this vast, intimidating place. They finally reached a room where a team of doctors and nurses was gathered around a bed. Mia's heart dropped at the sight of her mother, pale and unmoving, hooked up to all sorts of machines that beeped and hummed in a rhythm Mia didn't understand. Tubes and wires snaked around Sarah's body, connecting her to monitors that displayed numbers and lines Mia couldn't make sense of. It was terrifying, seeing her mother like this, so unlike the strong, vibrant woman who had always been her rock. A nurse gently guided Mia to a chair in the corner of the room, telling her to sit and wait while the doctors worked. Mia obeyed, her wide eyes never leaving her mother's still form. She had never felt so small, so powerless. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness, every beep of the machines only heightening her anxiety. She wished she could do something, anything to help her mother, but all she could do was sit there, her small body trembling with fear and exhaustion. Tears welled up in Mia's eyes, blurring her vision as she watched the doctors talk in low, serious tones. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but their expressions were grim, and that made the fear inside her grow even stronger. She was terrified that she might lose her mother, that the last thing she'd ever see of her would be her lying there, surrounded by cold, unfeeling machines. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and Mia's heart leaped as she saw her grandmother enter, her familiar face a welcome sight amidst the chaos. Mia jumped up from her chair and ran into her grandmother's arms, burying her face in the comforting warmth of her embrace. "Grandma!" Mia cried, her voice breaking with relief. "I'm so scared." Her grandmother held her tightly, her hand stroking Mia's hair in soothing, gentle motions. "Shh, it's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice filled with a calm that Mia desperately needed. "I'm here now. We're going to get through this together." Mia snuggled closer, feeling a little bit of the tension ease from her small body. She looked up at her grandmother, her eyes wide and pleading. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Her grandmother gave her a reassuring smile, though Mia could see the worry in her eyes. "The doctors are doing everything they can to help her, Mia. We just have to be patient and strong, like your mommy would want us to be." Mia nodded, taking a deep breath and trying to be brave, just like her grandmother said. She wanted to be strong for her mother, just like her mother had always been strong for her. The hours dragged on, and Mia stayed close to her grandmother, clinging to her like a lifeline. They sat together in the small room, the sounds of the hospital a constant, unsettling backdrop to their vigil. Mia's thoughts were a whirlwind, the fear and uncertainty gnawing at her insides like a relentless beast. She couldn't help but think back to the apartment, to the moment when she had found her mother so still and unresponsive. She had never been so scared in her life, and even now, the memory of it made her heart race with panic. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, one of the doctors approached them, his expression serious, but not unkind. "Mrs. Peterson, Mia," he began, addressing Mia's grandmother and herself. "Sarah is stable for now, but we're not out of the woods yet. She's responding to treatment, but it will take time for her to fully recover." Mia's grandmother nodded, her grip on Mia's hand tightening slightly. "Thank you, doctor," she said, her voice calm but tinged with the worry she had been trying to hide from Mia. "Can we see her?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, but only for a short while. She's still very weak, and we need to keep monitoring her closely." Mia felt her heart skip a beat as she followed her grandmother back to the bedside. Her mother was still unconscious, but there was a slight color returning to her cheeks, a faint rise and fall of her chest that was more reassuring than the shallow breaths Mia had seen earlier. Mia reached out, her small hand trembling as she gently touched her mother's arm. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Please, wake up." As if hearing her daughter's plea, Sarah's eyelids fluttered, and after a few agonizing moments, they slowly opened. Her eyes, though clouded with confusion, searched the room until they landed on Mia. "Mommy!" Mia cried out, her voice breaking with relief as she saw her mother's eyes open for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Sarah blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings. Her voice was weak, barely more than a hoarse whisper. "Mia, where am I?" "You're in the hospital, Mummy," Mia said, her voice trembling with both relief and fear. "You were really sick, but I called 911 and they came to help you. The doctors are going to make you better." Sarah's gaze shifted from her daughter to the machines surrounding her, and for a moment confusion clouded her expression. I don't remember," she murmured, her voice trailing off as she tried to recall what had happened. "I just remember feeling so tired. So very tired." Mia's grandmother gently stroked Sarah's hair, her voice soothing. "You're safe now, Sarah. Just rest. Mia and I are here, and we're not going anywhere." Sarah nodded weakly, her eyelids drooping as exhaustion overtook her. She was still so very tired, and the effort of staying awake was more than she could manage. Slowly, her eyes closed again, and she drifted back into a deep but peaceful sleep. Mia stayed by her mother's side, holding her hand and watching her breathe. She felt a mix of relief and lingering fear, the worry that had taken root in her heart, refusing to let go completely. A short while later, the door to the room opened again, and 2 police officers entered. They approached the bed quietly, their expressions serious as they took in the scene before them. One of them, a tall man with a kind face, spoke first. "Mrs. Peterson Mia," he said, nodding to them both. "We're here to ask Sarah a few questions about what happened, but it looks like she's resting now." Mia's grandmother nodded. "Yes, she just fell asleep. She's still very weak." The officer nodded, understanding. "That's all right. We can wait. We just need to get a better understanding of what happened to her." Mia, who had been listening quietly, looked up at the officer with wide, curious eyes. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice small. The officer crouched down to her level, his expression gentle. "Well, Mia, we're trying to figure out why your mommy got so sick. There might be something in your apartment that made her feel this way." Mia frowned, trying to make sense of what the officer was saying. She thought back to the apartment, to the strange, musty smell that had filled the air that morning. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now she wondered if it had something to do with what had happened to her mother. The officer gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, Mia. We're going to check everything out and make sure it's safe for you and your mommy." Mia nodded, though the worry still gnawed at her. She didn't understand everything that was going on, but she knew one thing for sure. She wanted her mother to get better, and she wanted them both to be safe. As the officers left the room, Mia sat back down in the chair beside her mother's bed. She watched the slow rise and fall of her mother's chest, clinging to the hope that the worst was behind them. Later that day, as Sarah continued to rest, the police returned with news. They had been back to the apartment, and what they found had left them deeply concerned. There was something unusual, one of the officers said to Mia's grandmother, his tone grave. When we entered the apartment, there was a strong, musty odor. We followed it to the bedroom where Sarah was found, and that's where we discovered it, mold and a lot of it. It was growing behind the bed, in the closet, even in some corners of the ceiling. The officer paused, letting the words sink in. It's toxic mold, Mrs. Peterson. It's very likely that's what made Sarah so sick. If Mia hadn't called for help when she did, well, it could have been much worse. Mia's grandmother paled, her hand going to her mouth in shock. Oh my God, I had no idea. The officer nodded sympathetically. Most people don't. It's not always easy to spot, but it can be very dangerous. We've contacted the building's management, and they're going to have to take some serious steps to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Mia listened quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't understand all of it, but she knew one thing. Her mother had been hurt by something they couldn't even see. As the officers left, Mia turned to her grandmother, her eyes wide with fear. "Is it going to hurt Mommy again?" she asked, her voice trembling. Her grandmother pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close. "No, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're going to make sure it never hurts her or you ever again." As the days passed, news of Mia's bravery spread quickly. It wasn't long before the local media caught wind of the story. Reporters descended upon the hospital, eager to capture the tale of the little girl who had saved her mother's life. Mia's face appeared on the evening news, her soft, tear-stained features illuminated on screens across town. They called her a hero, praised her courage, and marveled at the composure she had shown in such a terrifying situation. But beneath the accolades there was outrage. As the details emerged about the toxic mold that had silently spread through their apartment, the focus shifted. The media began to question how such a dangerous situation had been allowed to develop in the first place. The responsibility fell squarely on the shoulders of the building's owner, who had ignored complaints and neglected maintenance. Public outcry grew louder with each passing day, fueled by images of the mold-infested apartment and stories of other tenants who had also suffered from the unhealthy conditions. The pressure mounted, both legally and from the public, until the owner could no longer ignore it. Forced to take action, he agreed to compensate all the families living in the building, including Sarah and Mia. Crews were dispatched to thoroughly clean and renovate the building, ensuring that no one else would be exposed to the dangers that had nearly cost Sarah her life. But even as the world outside buzzed with news and developments, inside the hospital, the atmosphere was one of quiet reflection. Sarah had begun to recover, though she was still weak and tired from her ordeal. The doctors had reassured her that she would get better, but the process would take time. For now, Sarah's world had shrunk to the confines of her hospital room, with Mia as her constant companion. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm glow over the room, Sarah reached out and took Mia's hand. The little girl had hardly left her side, refusing to go home without her mother. Sarah looked at her daughter, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. "Mia," Sarah began, her voice soft and tinged with guilt. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all of this. I should have noticed the mold. I should have done something sooner. I never wanted you to be in danger." Mia shook her head, her grip tightening around her mother's hand. "It's okay, Mommy," she said, her voice firm despite her young age. "None of that matters. As long as we're together, I'm happy. I just want you to get better." Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she looked at Mia, marveling at the strength and love her daughter showed in every word and action. She reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Mia's forehead, her fingers trembling slightly. "You're so brave, Mia," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would do without you." Mia smiled, a small, innocent smile that tugged at Sarah's heartstrings. "I just did what you taught me, Mommy. You always told me to be brave and to take care of the people I love." Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, not wanting to upset Mia. But as she looked closer, she noticed something that made her heart clench. A faint but unmistakable bruise on Mia's hand, with the distinct imprint of teeth marks. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what had happened. "Mia, what happened to your hand?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking with concern. Mia hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her hand as if she had forgotten about the injury. "Oh, this?" she said, trying to sound casual. "It's nothing, Mommy. When you were sick, you were biting down really hard, and I didn't want you to hurt yourself. So I put my hand in your mouth." Sarah's eyes filled with tears once more, and this time she couldn't stop them from falling. The thought of her daughter, so small and fragile, enduring pain just to protect her. It was almost too much to bear. "Oh, Mia," Sarah sobbed, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry. You shouldn't have had to do that." "It's okay, Mommy," Mia murmured into her mother's shoulder, wrapping her arms around her in return. "I wanted to help you." Sarah held Mia close, the two of them clinging to each other as if the world outside had ceased to exist. In that moment, Sarah felt an overwhelming surge of love and gratitude for her daughter, a child who had shown more bravery and selflessness than anyone could have expected. She kissed the top of Mia's head, whispering her thanks over and over. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's health slowly improved, and the hospital room became a little less daunting. During this time, a new figure entered their lives. Dr. David Matthews, one of the attending physicians who had been overseeing Sarah's recovery. He was a kind, attentive man, always taking the time to explain Sarah's condition and treatment in a way that was easy for both her and Mia to understand. Dr. Matthews often stayed a little longer than necessary after his rounds, chatting with Sarah about everything from the weather to Mia's favorite books. He had a calm, reassuring presence that made Sarah feel at ease, even when discussing the most serious aspects of her health. One day, after Dr. Matthews had finished checking on Sarah, he lingered by her bedside, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Sarah," he began slowly, "I've been meaning to tell you. I'm really impressed by how you and Mia have handled everything. It's not easy, what you've been through." Sarah smiled, though her eyes were still tinged with sadness. "We've had no choice but to be strong," she replied softly. "But thank you, Dr. Matthews. Your kindness has made it a little easier." David returned her smile, and there was a warmth in his eyes that Sarah hadn't noticed before. "I'm glad I could help," he said. "But really, you've done so much on your own. Mia is lucky to have a mother like you." Sarah looked down at her hands, the compliment bringing a flush of warmth to her cheeks. It had been so long since she'd felt truly seen, truly understood by someone. "Thank you, David," she said, the words sincere and heartfelt. Over the next few weeks, as Sarah continued to recover, she and David grew closer. He was always there with a reassuring word, a comforting presence, and a gentle smile that made Sarah feel less alone. They talked about their lives, their struggles, and their hopes for the future, finding in each other a shared understanding that brought them closer with each passing day. Mia noticed the way her mother's face would light up when David entered the room, the way her laughter became more frequent and genuine. It was a welcome change after the months of stress and fear they had endured. One evening after David had left for the day, Sarah and Mia sat together by the window, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange, a peaceful contrast to the chaos they had recently lived through. "Mommy," Mia said quietly, "do you like Dr. Matthews?" Sarah glanced down at her daughter, a smile tugging at her lips. "I do, Mia. He's been very kind to us." Mia nodded thoughtfully, then looked up at her mother with wide, innocent eyes. "He makes you happy, doesn't he?" Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at her daughter, so wise beyond her years. "Yes, Mia," she admitted softly. "He does." Mia grinned, her earlier worry replaced by a simple, childlike joy. "I'm glad, Mommy. You deserve to be happy." Sarah's heart swelled with love and pride as she pulled Mia into her arms. "I love you, Mia," she whispered, holding her close. "I love you too, Mommy," Mia replied, snuggling into her mother's embrace. As they sat there, wrapped in each other's warmth, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. They had been through so much, but they had come out the other side stronger, closer, and with the promise of a brighter future ahead. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah's strength slowly returned. The doctors were pleased with her progress, though they warned her that recovery would be a gradual process. Mia never left her mother's side, her presence a constant source of comfort and love. The hospital room that had once felt so cold and sterile had become a place of healing, not just for Sarah's body, but for her spirit as well. The bond between mother and daughter grew stronger with each passing day, their love deepened by the trials they had endured together. When the time finally came for Sarah to leave the hospital, she and Mia were met with a bittersweet reality. Their apartment, the place they had called home for so long, was no longer safe. The toxic mold had been eradicated, and the building was undergoing extensive renovations, but Sarah knew in her heart that they couldn't return there. The memories of what had happened, the fear that had gripped their lives, were too strong. It was time for a fresh start. With the help of the building management and a modest compensation from the owner, Sarah began searching for a new place to live. It wasn't easy. Finding a safe, affordable home was a challenge, but Sarah was determined. She wanted a place where she and Mia could feel secure, where they could build new memories without the shadow of the past looming over them. After weeks of searching, they finally found it, a small, cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was clean, bright, and filled with the promise of new beginnings. Mia loved the little park down the street, where she could play under the shade of tall trees. And Sarah loved the quiet of the neighborhood, the sense of safety that had been missing for so long. Moving day was a flurry of activity, but there was a palpable sense of excitement in the air. As they unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, Sarah and Mia talked about all the things they would do in their new home. They planned to bake cookies in the small kitchen, fill the living room with plants, and hang Mia's drawings on the walls. Every corner of the apartment became a blank canvas for their hopes and dreams. "Mommy, I like it here," Mia said one evening as they sat together on their new couch, a soft blanket wrapped around them. The sun was setting outside, casting a warm, golden light through the windows. "I do too, sweetheart," Sarah replied, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. "This is our fresh start. We're going to make so many wonderful memories here." Mia nodded, her eyes shining with the innocence and wisdom of a child who had seen more than she should have, yet had come through it stronger. "As long as we're together, everything will be okay." Sarah smiled, pulling Mia closer. "That's right, my love. As long as we're together." The media continued to cover their story, but Sarah had learned to tune it out, focusing instead on the present, on the life she was rebuilding with Mia. She was proud of her daughter, proud of how brave and strong she had been, but she also wanted to protect her from the attention, to let her be a child again. Mia was a hero, but she was also just a little girl who needed the chance to grow up in peace. As they settled into their new home, another presence quietly grew in their lives: Dr. David Matthews. He had been there for Sarah during her recovery, not just as a doctor, but as a friend. Their conversations had started out clinical, focused on her health and progress, but over time, they had become more personal. David had a way of listening that made Sarah feel seen and understood, something she hadn't felt in a long time. He continued to visit after they moved into the new apartment, sometimes bringing flowers or books for Mia, and sometimes just coming by to check in. His visits became a bright spot in their days, a sign that there was more to life than just survival. There was also the possibility of happiness, of love. One afternoon, after David had left, Mia looked up at her mother with a thoughtful expression. "Mommy," she asked, "do you think Dr. Matthews will come over for dinner again?" Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Mia's face. "I think he just might if we invite him." Mia grinned, the idea clearly appealing to her. "Can we? I like him, Mummy. He makes you smile." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at Mia's words. "He makes me smile too, sweetheart," she admitted softly. "And I think he likes spending time with us." With that, a new chapter began to unfold in their lives. David's presence became a constant, not just a visitor, but a part of their family. He brought with him a sense of stability and care that Sarah hadn't realized she was missing. And as the weeks turned into months, the connection between them deepened, blossoming into something more than just friendship. Through it all, Mia thrived. The ordeal they had faced had left its mark, but it had also instilled in her a strength and resilience beyond her years. She began to talk about her future, about wanting to help people the way Dr. Matthews had helped them. Sarah listened, her heart swelling with pride as Mia spoke of her dreams, her eyes bright with determination. Their new home became a place of healing and growth, where the shadows of the past were slowly replaced by the light of a brighter future. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with me till the end of this incredible journey. Mia's story is more than just a tale of survival. It's a powerful reminder of how love and courage can overcome even the darkest moments. Think about it. A little girl, faced with unimaginable fear, stepped up and did what many adults might struggle to do. She saved her mother because of the bond they shared, and that's something truly remarkable. What really struck me was how Mia's bravery sparked a chain of events that not only saved her mother, but also brought about change for so many others living in dangerous conditions. It's a testament to how one small act can ripple out and make a huge difference. But beyond the drama and suspense, this story leaves us with a deep human lesson. Sometimes it's the smallest voices that carry the greatest strength. It's a reminder to cherish those we love and to stand up, even when we're scared. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Mia's journey. What did you take away from this story? Drop your comments below and let's talk about it. Until next time, stay safe and take care of each other.